Hi, and welcome to Chief for Yourself. Great to have you with us wherever you are in the world today. Our guest on this program is paying us her second visit. You'll remember teacher, best-selling author, and Zen Buddhist priest Karen Maezen Miller was with us a while back to talk about her book, Hand Wash Cold. And today she's back with a story that has its beginnings in a way that's familiar to a lot of us here in Southern California on a house hunting trip. When her family settles into a suburban Los Angeles house that has a 100-year-old Japanese garden, that garden reveals itself as a paradise that mirrors the wisdom of the natural world. Karen Maezen Miller is the author of Paradise in Plain Sight, Lessons from a Zen Garden. And when we say you're a priest, you were ordained, but we're not talking about the Webster definition of one who's a mediator between humans and God. How does a Zen priest differ from what we've come to know as an ordained priest here in mostly Christian America?
Right. Well, we have an idea that's based on what we've observed in Western traditions. And of course, Zen is an Eastern tradition. Actually, in the East, there are no priests per se. Typically in the past, a practitioner of Zen was a monk, a renunciate. But here in the West, we are not renunciates. We simply combine our practice and our commitment to practice in the context of our everyday lives. So because of that, we are called priests. Now, when you commit to the path of priesthood, essentially what you're doing is relinquishing your ego-driven delusions or difficulties in life for what you commit to transforming into a life of service. So that doesn't really have a high-minded context for us. It means that we are committed to living our practice and living our vows in the life as it appears in front of us and around us. Essentially, it means we take care of whatever appears. And that's why my life as a wife and a mother and the caretaker of a garden is, in fact, the life of a priest.
Mm-hmm. And to further clarify, Maezen is not a family name or what in my neighborhood they used to call a maiden name. Maezen is your Dharma name, right? How'd you get that name?
It's my Buddhist name, actually, yes. And in my lineage, when you first take vows, which is a public testament of your, although you're still a lay person, your public testament and commitment to your practice and to your practice with a teacher, that teacher will give you a new name. And that process is called, in the Zen tradition, jukai. Now, often in the West, people have dispensed with the application of those old ways. But in my tradition, which is really more classical in orientation, when you get a new name, you begin using a new name, and it really signifies that you've departed from whatever identity you might have assembled for yourself out of your own delusion. So, I mean, that I am called in the practice communities where I work, I'm called Maezen. And I, oddly enough, this isn't always the way it happens, I asked for that name. I asked for that name because I was so impressed with my first teacher, Maizumi Roshi, and I could not disassociate my intentions and motivations in my practice from what I saw him representing in terms of the power and the peace and the selflessness that he represented. So I asked to be named after him, which is, a pretty common device in any family.
Mm-hmm. Was it Roshi who told you your life is your practice?
He did, yeah. And that was really on first meeting. I think always what a Zen teacher wants to do is get you out of your head, out of your thinking mind that maybe idealizes, conceptualizes, or intellectualizes something like your practice or your path. He a teacher is always trying to call you out of your head so that you understand that the life you have, where you are, doing what needs to be done, is itself the practice. Bring your practice really to life, in your life, and then you can truly make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Looking at the word paradise, part of the book title, as it's used in the book, I wasn't aware of the original meaning of paradise. Talk about that definition and its place in the story.
Right. Well, early on, John, I too felt that I had, when I came to this place with this spectacular garden, just spending a little bit of time here, I realized what it wasn't, that it wasn't really perfectly tended, that were things here that needed to be fixed and repaired. It wasn't the textbook example, you see, of a Japanese garden. I needed to bring myself into, to pick up the great task before me, which was to care for and restore a garden. But so I, with friends, were helpful in that. I was given a lot of books to study up on how you care for a garden like the one that's in my backyard. And the books actually tended, for the most part, to make me feel even more inadequate and unprepared for the work at hand. But I did find one line in a very thick book about the history of Japanese gardens. The history of anything is like the history of everything. The Japanese garden that was brought into manifestation in Japan was actually originated in China. And those cultural and aesthetic features in China came from elsewhere, as everything is shared, universally through space and time. So the word paradise originated in Persia at a time when the very first cultivated gardens began to appear. And these were typically in the homes or behind the palaces of wealthy royals, for instance. They might, as a show of their wealth and their position, they walled grounds that they had available to them, that were in their possession, and they, inside those walled grounds, they cultivated fruit gardens and flower gardens. They, and sometimes were used to collect menageries, exotic animals. They became the sporting grounds, you see, of kings. And so paradise initially just meant that, a walled enclosure, a walled enclosure. But when I looked at that word, I realized what paradise really originally meant. It wasn't some future perfect place, in heaven that we might never actually get to. Paradise originally meant a backyard. And in my case, it means my backyard or your backyard. And what we're called to do is to really see where we are with those kind of eyes, instead of seeing it for what it's not and what it lacks and how impoverished we are. Can we see the beauty and the treasure that's here on this earth for us to inhabit?
Now, you and your husband don't do this kind of work. I mean, you weren't really handy in that. I guess it was a little daunting when you first laid eyes on it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Initially we thought it looked perfect, but that's through the eyes of an innocent. Things look perfect as they are, but once I got out into it, I realized that what I thought was just beautiful, lush, opulent growth was really invasive ivy that had come over and was covering everything that needed to be pulled up. The plants were old and in some case, diminished, half dead. Things were falling apart. So the more experience I had, and certainly the more information I had, the more critical I became. So initially we sought counsel from a lot of experts who had the right ideas for us. They wanted us to spend a lot of money or restore things, and had a massive scale and scope, and we just couldn't afford to do that. So what I was reduced to doing was doing the easiest and most obvious things, which in my case was raking leaves and picking weeds. And I'll tell you, John, that's just about all the work there is for us to do if we can bring ourselves to doing the things that seem beneath us. We can have a tremendous impact. That's where we started.
I hear so much of stripping away the ego. We can't eliminate the ego, but it is about somehow dealing with that to where the ego doesn't become, I guess the word is, a master.
Sure, my teacher and many wise people have said, the mind, the ego mind, the mind that says I, I want, I need, I think, I know, that mind that's actually in some cases called the monkey mind. It's just never satisfied, never rests, always issuing a critical commentary either about oneself or about, others. We know that. That's where we live most of our time, and it's exhausting. And it's always negative. We practice the most critical negative blame and judgment, in our thoughts. Mm-hmm. Well, that mind, they say, is a wonderful servant, but it's a miserable master. Yeah. And so we live enslaved to that way of thinking, which always leaves us feeling overwhelmed and under-equipped. In the case of the garden, all I had to do was think about what I didn't know how to do, what I couldn't do, what my limited resources were, how unlucky and misfortunate I was, in order then to feel awful, And what's interesting about this house where we live with the garden is that it was always difficult to sell. It hasn't had many owners over the course of its 100 years that the garden has been here, and I think that's why. Most people set foot in a place like this and say, I can't do this. I can't take care of it. But for whatever reason, we were foolish enough to get in over our heads. And that's really what we're always called to do. Be foolish, get in over your heads, and whatever, situation presents itself, then you're going to learn something really powerful and significant about yourself. You're going to learn that you can do what you think you can.
Years ago, when I moved into my own house, I made a decision to buy purely on a visceral feeling. The energy was so strong that the amenities and the location all were secondary. Your house seemed to have that kind of a pull too. You knew it was the place for you. Did you feel that inside despite everything you were seeing?
Oh, I felt it instantly. Mm-hmm. And I think in a way, many of us, I think those are the places that we end up or where we land, or when we're lucky enough to go looking, because we might have whatever motivates that search, and we're talking about a spiritual search as well as just a house hunting trip. We're always looking for, quote, home. Well, in a spiritual sense, we're looking for a spiritual home, and in a material sense, we're looking for our physical home, and we know it. Sometimes as soon as we walk onto the ground, and that's what I experienced in this place, at the end of a very disappointing and unsuccessful day of house hunting, we were brought to a place that was not on the list, it wasn't on the map, it didn't have what we thought we needed or wanted, but nonetheless, an agent brought us to the curb, and we got out of the car, and instantly, upon walking onto the property, there was an old Japanese-style garden gate that was very wobbly and old and weathered and not pretty. But I knew instantly that I was not someplace like all the other places that I had been, that I was someplace that had a powerful, deep, you could even say a soul connection to me that was had drawn me to it. And I had grown up in Southern California, although I lived away from Southern California for most of my life, but I sensed such familiarity in the smell of the air, the dry air, the grass, the orange blossoms, the fruit trees, the flowers. It was eerily familiar to me. And I knew even before we set foot inside the house and then saw the garden in the back that I had come to precisely the place that my entire life had led me. Now, everybody needs to grant, suspend their disbelief and just realize that where you are now is exactly where your life has led you, and the life of every ancestor before you has led you to the place you are. And if you can accept that and suspend the search, there's a tremendous sense of relief and arrival that you will have in your own life. And you can get to work doing what needs to be done right where you are.
Your writing very nicely weaves the mystical and the practical. You bring in slices of life, as we used to call them in broadcasting, and very much personal situations too. I was wondering, when you write, do you sit down with ideas and lay them out, I don't want to say as a template, but put the facts down, or do things call to you and say, this book has to be written, I have to be written? Does it almost bug you?
Well, it's a little bit of both, to tell you the truth, because we have to have form, usually, some template that gives us a discipline in order to move into a process like this, which is completely where the outcome is completely unknown. In my case, John, I only write what I've experienced. I write my life. So in that way, all I can share are episodes from my life, which is quite ordinary and very personal. It seems intimate and yet accessible and ordinary. Because my life is my practice, what I derive from the literal experience in my life is the spiritual. If I don't find it there, I won't find it anywhere. I don't make it up. But the process is one where, I have to have a list of contents, to give me structure, but I have no idea what I'm going to write when I sit down. It appears. And I work with it. And I often say this, that I write to console myself, to reassure myself, to reconcile conflict, and to bring myself to a place of peace. So if I'm experiencing that in the writing, the fact is that the reader will derive the same experience from the reading of that, and it becomes it's really a marvelous, almost supernatural relationship that occurs when the mind of the writer meets the mind of the reader, and so much is shared in common.
Nice.
That's my process.
Yeah. Sometimes we hear it said that Buddhism is one of the world's great religions, usually lumped in with Christianity and Islam. How do you actually define Buddhism?
Well, it's a practice. It's a practice. Now, every religion, every tradition has within it true contemplative practices, but people may identify themselves as believers of a particular religious doctrine and not really practice it. We see that so much. So I like to, just because of my own training, in which, the training in Zen is to sit yourself down on a cushion and turn and face the wall and be still and quiet for the entire day. We get up from time to time and we walk around and we eat and we work. But essentially, it's a meditative practice. It's meditation. We do in Buddhism, in Zen Buddhism, we do exactly what Buddha did, which was sit down. If you look at all the images of Buddha, what's he doing? He's sitting down and he's doing the practice and he's teaching and sharing the practice. So in our case, in Zen, we say, well, if that was good enough for Buddha, that's got to be good enough. So let's do that. And I think some people say that it's not a religion because it doesn't have it doesn't have doctrine.
Right.
It doesn't have a set of beliefs. It's experiential. And frankly, I don't even care what it's called now. For me, it is a practice that transforms my life into something that is beautiful and something that I that brings me joy and something that I can share. It makes the world, my world, better than it would be otherwise if I was just practicing my own fear, anger, and greed. So that to me is what it is. It's just a better way.
And something that seems to be a great difference between Buddhism and all of the other religions, practices in the world is that with Buddhism, I think you're doing what Buddha did, not what Buddha said. I think it's a huge difference, isn't it?
Absolutely. In fact, that's what Buddha said. Buddha said, don't do what I say. No. Don't say what I say. Do what I did. I always, actually, John, I'm always kind of humored when I go online or read books and I see Buddha being quoted so much. You know, everyone's sharing Buddha's quotes because Buddha said, don't quote me. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, you know, here we are. So, yeah, we can get, it's a pointing finger. We can get direction, you know, from the words of the masters and the words of the teacher. But we need more than directions. You know, if we're going to walk the path, we have to walk it, you know.
Yeah. Well, there's another quote that's thrown around a lot that Buddha supposedly said, when you meet the Buddha on the road, you must kill him, which I can understand that, you know, you don't take anything on its face value. You live it more than you listen or you take the words.
That's a Zen koan that's often quoted. And how I see it is this way. If you think that Buddha is outside of you, then you're mistaken. You know, that's your idea of Buddha. And Buddha means, let's clarify, it just means awake. So Buddha means, you know, is an awakened being. So are you awake? You know, then that's your Buddhahood. So, and when you are fully awake, there is nothing outside of you anyway. You are always in your own conscious mind. And so everything that you experience is your mind. There's nothing outside of you or beyond you. So if you've conceptualized Buddha, if you think Buddha is the person, place, or thing, then you're mistaken. You have to eradicate that concept, that's delusion, and then you are Buddha.
So is it fair to say that we're not doing any kind of seeking here? We're not seekers. Everything we need to quote unquote seek is right in front of us. It's just a matter of seeing it.
It is a matter of seeing, and just so it's not confusing to people, until you can see, you go looking. You know, you go. You know, you do seek, but ultimately the conclusion of your seeking is to no longer seek, to have the kind of clarity that you realize that where you are as you are is where you're called to practice, and you're not looking for more, you're not looking beyond, you are simply seeing what's appeared as it is, and that's the enlightened state. And out of that comes great compassion, because no longer judging something as being not as good as something else, no longer looking for something else. You can respond appropriately and wholeheartedly to whatever appears in your world to take care of. You know, they say, you know, the question to the master is, after enlightenment, then what? And the master says, eat when hungry, sleep when tired. You see, everything then becomes the function of a Buddha. You know, your life is the life of a Buddha. What more are you looking for?
As far as concepts such as heaven and hell or sin, how does Buddhism speak to those?
Well, we create our own heaven and we create our own hell, you know. And as for sin, again, that's a concept. We know when we do right and we know when we do wrong. And aside from the labels and the judgments of right and wrong, we in our hearts and in our minds, we know when we're kind, we know when we're unkind. We know when we're greedy. We know when we're generous. We know when we're truthful. We know when we lie. My first teacher said, there are really three guiding signposts, three rules to observe so that you can conduct yourself in an appropriate way. One is to don't deceive yourself. Don't lie to yourself. Don't make excuses for yourself. That's the second one. First eradicate all the reasons and explanations and justifications that you've given yourself for behaving badly. Strip those away. That's the first admonition. Don't deceive yourself. The second one, don't make excuses for yourself. And the third one, take responsibility for yourself.
Mm.
Now, in a life of practice, when we come to the third step, taking responsibility for yourself, if you're no longer seeing yourself as separate or opposed to the world you inhabit, taking care of yourself means taking care of everything. Do good. Just do good. Now, I myself, I spend a good part of every day, John, not doing good. Every time I doubt someone, nag someone, hound someone, think critically or unkindly of someone, that's not good. So I practice stopping that.
Lots of reminders of practice, I guess. Yeah. Final question is a short one. What would you like to see readers take away from this book or from your writing in general?
Well, in this particular book, what I'd like them to take away is exactly what I asked them to do, which is to come and see the garden. And by that I mean two things. One, come and see my garden, which is open and available and has been waiting for 100 years for people to come and visit. Anybody who wants to visit this garden can. So that's one thing. But the other thing, and the more important thing, is come and see your own life as a garden. I mean, it has the earth, it has the sky, it has the heavens, it has the beauty, it has the power, it has the dimensions, it contains the entire universe. Your life is a garden. So how will you care for it? What will you cultivate? And most importantly, what will you leave behind? You can start doing that right now. So that's what I like people to take away. The same lessons the garden has given to me.
Your website is KarenMaezenMiller.com. That's Maezen, M-A-E-Z-E-N, spelled as one word, Karen Maezen Miller. Any new books on the way, retreats, other projects?
Oh, I have, eventually there'll be another book, but for right now, this is the one, and I travel frequently, going to give talks and lead retreats all over the country. They're all listed on my website at KarenMaezenMiller.com. I'll be in Washington, D.C. in a week or two. I'll be in Houston. I'll be in Western Massachusetts and Connecticut. I go wherever I'm asked in order to share my practice, which is the only thing I have to share.
The book is Paradise in Plain Sight, Lessons from a Zen Garden from Karen Maezen Miller. Thank you for writing it and reminding us that everything really is okay. We just have to look at it. Please come back and talk with us again.
Oh, I'll be happy to. Thank you so much, John.
All right, Karen, have a great day. Thanks. Thanks
Bye-bye.
again. Bye-bye. Karen Maezen Miller, and we will be, as always, linking to Karen's website at achieve4yourself.com. Some of the most recent interviews are available there too. Shows are also archived on Achieve for Yourself's video page. That's at youtube.com/geohost, GIOHOST, youtube.com/geohost. We keep the videos there too. And make sure you subscribe as well to the blog post from Genulines. Best way to find out what's coming up and who's going to be on the program. That's going to just about do it for today. I want to thank you so much for being with us. Be well, and I will talk to you soon.